Well, the key points of my presentation is on the reflection 10 years later about the Cork Declaration, is that it might not have influenced immediate rural policy, but in the longer term it had a very significant impact on rural development policy. And if we look at the program for the next 7 years, most of the principles that were laid in Cork are there. So I would say it was a delayed impact, but an extremely important one, because it drew a new conception of rural policy. On the other hand, one should not think that everything that Cork said and how it was done at the time was perfect. I think there were some limitations in the conception of the Cork Declaration, and these have been, I think, solved by other documents and reflections that were done after Cork. So now we have a good system of understanding of what kind of policies rural development needs.
And you would be then very pleased that rural development is going down the right direction now, taking in what was happened in Cork and what then happened subsequently in Salzburg?
Well, I think it's we have a long way to go to have an ideal vision of what, I mean, my personal idea of how rural development policies should be in the future. But however, I think that we are going in the right direction, and you had previously rural different stakeholders in the rural world who did not speak to each other, and that today are speaking to each other. And this is, I think, it's will be even more so in the future. And they will be obliged to do this in order to use, so the policy is pressuring the rural stakeholders to agree, to negotiate, to have good partnerships, and this is, I think, is a very good development, because I mean, it's not that Brussels will think of all the solutions. It will be the actors themselves in the field that will make rural policies work. If we don't get that,
Now, you have a great feel for rural development, and what is your ideal vision? What would your ideal vision be for rural development?
Well, we did this exercise about 3 years ago with a group of experts, policymakers, and practitioners, and we said, well, if we had to design a rural policy for the next 25 years, so that nobody gets scared with what we say, it's really a long term. I think that rural policies should incorporate agricultural policy. That it is not true that in a certain way agricultural policy and rural policy have to get nearer and talk to each other, and be differentiated by different areas, because there are very different needs, even more with enlargement among member states about what kind of rural policy. So in order to, you cannot just give flexibility to rural policies, you need to give flexibility also to agricultural policies in order to respond to new needs and food preferences and globalization. And all this, if you increase the linkage with rural policy, this will come much more easier. So I'm thinking of a vision in which you have rural development programs that consider environmental issues, agricultural issues, and regional development issues as a coherent whole, and differentiated with lots of margins of freedom for each region to assess how they have to mix these aspects.
And do you find that the absence of flexibility is hindering rural development at the moment?
Yes, because in fact, if you look at the list of measures that you can apply on the axis, there are some things which are very rigid, like compensatory allowances, and things which are very flexible, like, for example, services to the rural population. And you have to get flexibility in the whole package and much more greater freedom for regional authorities or national authorities, according to at what institutional level they do rural policies, in deciding what is the mix that they need. But they cannot leave one of the stakeholders outside and saying we have a common agricultural policy, and on the other side we have adapted rural development policies. The two things have to eventually converge. Yeah? I'm not arguing in favor of renationalization of agricultural policy at all. I'm just arguing for, in an enlarged Europe, for the European Union to go on coordinating and drawing common rules of the game, but then allowing much more flexibility at the member states level to negotiate whatever their needs, which greater margins of freedom.
Yeah, and the follow-on for that, of course, as well, is that member states would want to have flexibility within the state itself, because the diversification that exists from one end of, we'd say, Italy to the other end of Italy is quite significant, isn't it?
Well, in Italy you have also agricultural policy is a competence of the regions, which is very different from centralized states, where it is a competence of the national level. But in large member states like Germany, Spain or Italy, you have a very decentralized rural policy, and hopefully in the future. France is the only exception of a very large country, of a large country with a centralized programming. Just by it, and I'd say you've already touched it. What are the big challenges now facing rural development? The big challenge. The big challenges of rural development, I think, is to get leader groups and local actors to talk with farming interests at regional level. I mean, even if in principle there was nothing against farmers getting involved in local development, in fact they have not. If we go and look exposed to what happened, they were not greatly involved in leader actions. So one can understand why this happened, but in fact, in the future, if you want to have coherent rural development, you will have to start discussing what young farmers need from a local economy. You will have to discuss what local products, how they can reach larger markets. These things you cannot just deal with leader groups. You will need to have a little bit more an ambitious agenda in terms of development when you start incorporating farmer interests and how they can become competitive, and how can, for example, leader groups help farmers become more competitive. If they do such a thing, then the integration between the two groups will come out of reality, and this, I think, would be a very good outcome. Groups in rural areas have been dealing with pieces of policy separated from each other, and this is a negative aspect, and it's also very costly. It's not an efficient way of running a policy. So if you achieve a much greater coherence and cohesion between the different actors, and talk to each other and negotiating and understanding each other's needs, then all the discussion about this is my money and this is your money will eventually subside and reduce its relevance, which is it's not a very good argument when it's not a reasonable way of dealing with agricultural policy or rural policy for my.
Okay, Elena, look, thank you very much.
You're welcome.